We have several hundred people here from all over Latin America. They are members of the Inter-American Press Association, a nonpartisan group that first and foremost is for freedom of expression. Many of them have read your book, Fear, and loved it, and now looking forward to the chance to talk with you and hear some of your thoughts, and then we'll have questions. As I understand it, you're going to speak to us for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have questions?
That's fine, but I can compress that. I'm much more interested in your questions or their questions. I think the first point to make has to do with the controversy and tragedy involving the killing now of Jamal Khashoggi, who was a columnist for the Washington Post newspaper. Very grisly details coming out about this, but also what's very important, and it really reminds me of Watergate 45 years ago when the Nixon administration took the position that underlings, people who were on the staff of Nixon's reelection committee in 1972, 1973, were the ones who orchestrated all of this, were the ones who made the decisions. Of course, we know now it took 2 years to unravel that and discovered that Nixon was the one behind all of these things, not some underling. And the effort of the Saudi government to say, oh, look, it's, what have they arrested? 18 people, and 5 people have lost their jobs and so forth, is very much and has every single echo of the Watergate cover-up. And the big question here is there's some mechanism to get to the bottom of it. In the United States during Watergate, there was a whole process involving the Congress, independent investigators, and the Supreme Court and the press. Internationally, there is no such organization. Joe, what do you think of that?
Well, the question for you is, what do you see as the next step here in Washington? Where is President Trump going to take this? We saw how he reacted just a few days ago, seemed to be diverting focus on the Saudis and thinking of all sorts of accidental possibilities. It's looking more like clear-cut murder and cover-up. What is the next move for him?
The only thing that can happen here is the United States has to, President Trump did say there would be extreme punishment or severe punishment if this was something that was attributable to the Saudi government or even the Crown Prince, who's really, as you know, the de facto ruler in Saudi Arabia. And how do you force this? The only way to force it is to take actions and attempt to isolate Saudi Arabia. That's very difficult because, as you know, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf cooperation states, and Israel have formed an alliance against Iran, and President Trump and the Israelis and the Saudis are paranoid about Iran, very, very concerned what Iran might do, that it might get a nuclear weapon. So the question here is, what's the leverage? Do you see any?
Well, I'm not so sure. As you just phrased it, it looks like we might be, there could be tremors of war in this. It could get very violent.
Who would be involved in the war?
Well, aren't you thinking about Iran? And as we lean closer to Iran, that's going to further incite Saudis, and that's the idea.
Yes, let's God help us hope there is not a war. That would be tragic. One other thought I had on all of this is in the United States, under Trump, the power of the presidency has surged in a very dramatic way. He dominates the debate in this country. I would call him, in every way, the media president. And in being the media president, he has set up the media is the new political opposition, not the Democratic Party, but the media is the problem, as he says regularly, the enemy of the people, fake news. And what's happened here, and I think it's a significant change, and I was talking to a Republican senator recently, somebody in President Trump's party, and I said, I worry about my business, the news media, that we seem to be the opposition. And this senator said, oh, don't worry about your business, the news media. Everyone really sees that the media has just become another form of politics. And so if you look back on this, and I'm somewhat of a prisoner of the Watergate-Nixon experience, that the strategy here really is the old Nixon strategy with a new energy and focus: blame the press, make the issue the conduct of the press, not the conduct of the president. And anyway, Joe, what do you think? Does that ring true to you? I guess I'm not hearing an answer.
Hi,
Hello?
Bob. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, good. Sorry for that. Just before you and I started talking, I was speaking with Martha Ramos, the publisher of 64 newspapers throughout Mexico, and she brought up this very idea of enemies of the people, journalists as enemies of the people. And there's a sense of, we're seeing evidence of leaders around the country picking up on Trump's language, and we're seeing harmful behavior from the people in these different countries, particularly here in Latin America, where Marta and others have said to me there are some rather impromptu assaults on the streets of journalists trying to do their jobs. And our thought was, what do you think about the way it's spreading, or if it is spreading?
Well, in resorting to violence in any form, obviously, is totally unacceptable. The bad part of this in the United States is just the other night, President Trump at a rally praised a congressman who assaulted a journalist some time ago, a journalist from the Guardian newspaper, United Kingdom. And so you have not just acquiescence on the part of the president, you actually have him praising a violent reaction. He has some millions of supporters, and let's hope this does not spread.
What do you think?
Other thought I had in all of this is what's the remedy? And I think back to a very famous Robin Williams movie called Dead Poets Society, in which Robin Williams plays a renegade instructor at a boys' prep school. And in one scene, he literally gets up on the desk and says, I stand on my desk to remind myself we need to find new ways to think about things. And I think the media we have to find new ways to think about things, that we need to examine our process. Too many reporters go on television who they are incited by Trump's actions. and particularly his criticism of the media. And so the reporters on television become emotionally unhinged themselves, and then Trump points to that. See, look, they're all against me. This is unfair. So what do you do? On the book I just did on Trump fear, my approach was to, quite frankly, drop out, not do stories for the Washington Post, stay off television, and dig deeply and go visit people who worked in the White House in their homes. There was a time last year while I was working on this, it was 11 o'clock at night. I called a White House aide who called him at home. It was 11 o'clock and said, "I'd like to interview you." And he said, "Sure, call the office. We'll do something." The typical brush off. I said, "How about now?" He said, used a profanity and said, "It's 11 o'clock at night. Are you crazy?" I said, "I'm 4 minutes from your house." And then he said, "Okay, 4 minutes. How do you know where I live?" I said, that's easy to find out. So he let me into his home, and I stayed hours. It was almost dawn when I left. And I realized we have to go see people in their homes. When President Trump called me in August before the book came out to complain that I had not interviewed the president, I said that there were 6 people in the White House or in Trump's circle that I contacted, and he acknowledged a couple of them, but I just told him outright, this is a pivot point in history for the United States, and I could not go to the White House and find out what was going on. So it's the old technique I learned from my colleague Carl Bernstein in Watergate. You've got to go knock on doors. I think that we need to get off the internet and that we need to start connecting with people more face to face. Thoughts, Joe?
The editor of El Dia in La Plata was thinking along those lines exactly, how do you do what you do? And you've taken us right into one of the crucial things, which is knocking on people's doors, sometimes at unexpected hours, and getting a surprising to many people amount of acceptance on this. It seems that there'd be a lot of reporters who would think it would be just beyond the pale and would restrain themselves from doing this sort of thing. Do you get people who say to you, "Get out of here, Bob, I'm not talking with you, and what are you doing on my front step?"
Yes, sometimes you get no, but what is astonishing, the number of times you get yes. And in the Trump administration, as the book shows, there are all kinds of people there who have a higher level of anxiety about what Trump is doing and some of the ideas that Trump has. And so if you can get to their home, and people, it's probably the most comfortable place for any individual. If you can get there, they will open up. They often have documents and notes. It's a painstaking process, but if you do not actually use these extraordinary means, and in truth, they should not be considered extraordinary. It should be considered routine when you have such a secretive White House where they try to close down media access to the people who work for Trump. Now, of course, Trump comes out and talks all the time, but as my newspaper, the Washington Post, has documented, in his time as president, there are about 4,200 statements he's made that are just false or highly misleading. So to get around that, You have to find people of conscience, people of courage, quite frankly, who are willing to speak out. And this needs to be the routine rather than sitting on the internet in an office or even using the telephone. Joe, does that make any sense? Or
it makes a lot of sense, and some of the questions that come up here are in reading your book. Some of the subjects, some of the people who are quoted or who you've clearly spoken with, come out not looking that great, and that raises the question: what motivates folks to talk to you in such an open way, and do they lose sight of where they might, how they might be perceived?
Well, as you know from years of working yourself, people like to talk. And interestingly enough, and I think this is an important element, people like to think of themselves as truth tellers, and they will often make what lawyers call admissions against interest. As you suggest, they will say things that do not necessarily make them look good. I explain in some detail in the book how people close to the president were quite willing to remove documents from his desk to keep him from signing orders that would trigger all kinds of bad relations with Europe, South Korea, Mexico, Canada in the NAFTA agreement. So it's a time for extraordinary means. They should not be illegal, of course. Reporters should not be involved in hacking other, government officials' email accounts or doing something like that. It should be very much above board. If we go to people as reporters and take those people as seriously as they take themselves, one thing you know in Washington, everyone takes themselves seriously. And so if you go and you listen and listen carefully, I think you have a chance to break down that wall that has been erected around the Trump presidency.
Talk about some of the denials that came out when the book was published. You seem to have what the characters in your book did down cold. Yet several people denied things that you documented pretty well, and I think including the question of removing letters from the president's desk. I think Sessions had some denials. How do you counter that, or how do you deal with that, so that, and how confident are you that you've got it right?
I'm very confident I've got it right, and I anticipated some of this idea of removing documents from the president's desk. I actually reprint a copy of something that was removed from the president's desk to illustrate that. And if you open to about page 10, you will see the document itself. And look, these are politically calculated survival denials. I understand people have to say things like that. So yes, there's the document. And President Trump said, well, if Gary Cohn, who was the chief economic advisor, did this, he would have been fired in 2 seconds, and so it couldn't have happened. Well, it outlines exactly what happened. Cohen has been asked about this publicly. He will not comment, and there the document is itself. People need to survive. Back during the Nixon era, we called it the non-denial denial. And we've seen these denials. Oh, the book does not fully capture all of my experience in the Trump administration. Well, that's not a denial. You can say that about anything. No book, no effort is going to capture somebody's experience in its totality.
Exactly. We have a few dozen, perhaps more than 100 students in the audience, and one of them is asking the question, with all the experience that you have, I believe you started at the Washington Post right out of Yale, is that right?
No, I did not. I got out of Yale University in 1965. I had to spend 5 years in the Navy because I was in Naval ROTC.
Yeah.
And I did not like the Navy. I was opposed to the Vietnam War because I was on a ship off the coast of Vietnam. I saw up close and in classified information the folly of that war. So I was going to go to law school. I realized that I would get out of law school at age 30. And at that point in your life, you think age 30 is the end of life. So I decided to try to get a job at the Washington Post. I got a 2-week tryout, which I failed. I went and worked for a weekly paper for a year, and then the Post hired me back. And I enjoyed it so much. I was assigned the night police beat from 6:30 at night to 2:30 a.m. I would go home and sleep some, come back in at 10 or 11 o'clock and try to do a day story also. That enthusiasm, I think, led the editors the morning of the Watergate burglary, which was a wonderful, beautiful Saturday in June 1972. They said, who would be dumb enough to come in and work this morning? And my name was at the top of the list, so I was called in to start working on this story and was sent to the courthouse to see the 5 Watergate burglars who were in business suits connected to the CIA. Had immediately established the seriousness of the crime here, and then Carl Bernstein and I started working together on it.
You seem to have learned journalism on the job, as many of us did, starting right at the base of foundation, really, of a lot of reporting, the police beat. The students are asking, what advice can you give them? How should they apply themselves to start rising up the ranks of journalism and making an impact?
I teach this journalism seminar second term at Yale University now each year. And one of the things I tried to, I guess it's to focus, a focus that I try to give the students. First of all, get off the internet. Don't go to the library, but actually go to the scene at the university or in the town of New Haven and find something to really investigate and do a detailed examination of. They're a little resistant to do this because we've trained people to use the internet and use library and books and not firsthand observation. As you know, Joe, journalism is firsthand observation. Then they, by and large, to a person, come up with a project that really peels and often blows the top off something that's going on that it needs to be corrected. So now the second thought I have on this is if you're assigned to work 8 hours a day, work 2 hours more, so you're working 10 hours. I think if you do that, not every day, but regularly, you will increase your usefulness to the organization you were working for by about at least 50%. And if you work 4 hours a day extra, so you're working 12 hours, you will double your usefulness to the organization and to yourself. So much of this has to do with hard work, has to do with immersing yourself. If you're a foreign correspondent, you need to know everything that's going on in that city and country, not just the politics, but the culture, the economy, and reporters, foreign correspondents who've been successful have been ones who exercise that total immersion in it always involves extra hours. You agree, Joe, or
Foreign
not?
correspondents live the story. It's 24-hour-a-day job. There isn't any time off, and I haven't met any good foreign correspondents who would like it to be any other way. The beauty of being a foreign correspondent is everything around you is a story. You don't have any downtime, and for those of us who are really eager, that couldn't be better. And you're in Washington, and you've got similar circumstances. Everywhere
Yes,
you look, there's a story.
I think it's not quite 24 hours a day. Maybe you work in your sleep, but you need to sleep. But the rest of the time, at least particularly when there's an important story, I mean, think about the Trump presidency and what's gone on, and what I deal with in the book in as much detail as possible, what Trump does as president, what his policy and decisions have been involving North Korea, the Middle East, the war in Afghanistan, which unbelievably continues now into its 18th year. All of the economic issues that he has dealt with, the immigration issues, the trade issues, and describe exactly what he does. I found myself, I'm now age 75, energized by this, and more than happy to devote the time. If you can't mail it in, you have got to do it if you want to get the 6 o'clock bus home every night. It's not going to work for you or the organization. That is just the way it is. At the same time, there will be moments when you will take vacation, or you will you won't work as intensely. But when something is before you, don't cheat yourself. Don't cheat the organization you're working for by not having that total immersion, that extra effort. It really pays off.
And we can see from your experience that total immersion is energizing. It makes the whole thing more exciting and worthwhile, and you do a fantastic job in the course of it.
Well, it demands a lot, if I may say, on this book, on the Trump book, Fear. My wife, Elsa Walsh, who had worked for the Post and worked for the New Yorker magazine, read the book, edited it 6 times, would kick me in the rear end if something was not confirmed, or there were avenues of inquiry that were useful. And in a very important way, if I can offer this on a personal note, she, when I had to go interview somebody at night, or have somebody over for dinner, for a 4 or 5 hour dinner, or I had to go up and work in my office at home after dinner, she not once dropped the penalty flag on me and said, now wait a minute, what about our marriage and relationship? She knew that it required that intense involvement and focus, and very much to her credit, not mine, she's the one who established the work ethic around the house of, this is our project, this is what we're doing, this potentially has consequence, because we can describe what the president really has done in the last 20 months as chief executive.
We have a question here now from Gabriela Vivanco from Ecuador. And she's saying that you've spoken about finding new ways to do our job as journalists. What do you suggest to those journalists and editors who have to meet a daily deadline and can't afford to stay away and devote long hours to every thread of a story, as you demonstrated in the book? How do they deal with daily journalism and daily deadlines and apply the kinds of things that you aspire, that you advocate?
That is a superb, important question, and I think the solution is on the heads of the editors or the producers. They have to be patient, and yes, you need to cover the daily story intensely, focus on it. But if I were the editor of the Washington Post, I would take half the staff covering Trump and the Trump administration and give them the running room and the breathing space to spend a week, a couple of weeks, a month, or maybe even longer on particular threads of the story. If the person, the editor, the boss at the top doesn't say, okay, we've got a lead on an important story, let's follow it out. And it is the failure to follow out that I think we often pay the price of just having a little piece of the story. We should raise the bar on ourselves and insist on getting more of the story. Obviously, you never get all of the story, but Carl Bernstein and I always have used the term, you want to get the best obtainable version of the truth. And that means long hours. We used to have a little sign we'd put on the computers of people at the Post, and it was just FAA, and it meant focus, act aggressively. And if you don't focus, if you don't act aggressively, I think you don't get there.
Right. The Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal seem to be doing some of what you were saying. They seem to have devoted more than a handful of reporters each, and they're breaking stories all the time, and they are using some of the techniques that I think you've used in your book. There also is a wave of criticism which starts at the White House, but is broader and probably a little bit more measured, and that is that reporters are getting too much into the story, and that rather than sticking with straight facts, there's commentary. There seems to be, in some cases, moving in a partisan direction. Now, I understand that straight facts can sometimes be not result in the truth. But talk about that idea of the reporters going beyond what was thought to be the norm before the Trump administration.
An important question, but I think straight facts actually, if you have them nailed down, they can tell the whole story, and you don't need to put a spin on it and just deal it out. Again, I had time to work on this book, but somebody would say, oh, there was a meeting and the following happened. I was able to track down and say the meeting was at 5:15 p.m. Tuesday, July 18th, in the White House Chief of Staff's office. This is who was there, this was the issue, and in that specific case, it was a fight between the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster. And H.R. McMaster literally, according to verbatim notes I got, said to the Secretary of State, you are affirmatively undermining the national security process. You were going off and doing things on your own. So facts always have a power. I think it's absolutely essential that we bleach the emotion out as much as possible. It's difficult for people. I was talking to an editor at one of the other newspapers, their Washington bureau, and he was saying he would edit stories, and then he would see one of his reporters on television saying something on TV that the editor had literally edited out of the story. Ben Bradley, the former editor of the Post, used to call this the extra squeeze, that you take, gee, these are the facts I've got, and you take an extra squeeze and say more than is supported by the facts. I think we need to avoid that. We also need to face the reality that a large percentage of the people do not trust the media. How do we get back to building that relationship of trust, getting it right, getting specifics, and not going on television and give a supercharged emotional version of what we have found out?
I think I hear you saying that that the reporters covering Trump now might be wise to drop back a bit, cool down a little, so that their stories don't seem to mimic his rhetoric.
Yes, and look, Trump, as I was saying, his strategy is make the press the opposition, and it's been quite effective, and a lot of people in the press are taking the bait and having these debates on television with him. And then on the other side, you see Fox News, which generally embraces and praises everything the president does. When I exercise a couple of times a week, in the morning I will watch MSNBC for half an hour and then watch Fox News for half an hour. It is absolutely astonishing. They are portraying two different worlds. And then my source, Republican senator, who said, you know, we've just become another form of politics. We're validating that, and we've got to find some way to tune it back. It's difficult because Trump is attacking the media regularly. He also will pretty much say anything, deny things that are evident and physically provable. And of course, for journalists, the building blocks of our work are facts. And if you can't agree on the facts, it makes it difficult.
We have some of those same issues that develop here in the region of Latin America. Some of the leaders are infuriating at times, and sometimes that the journalists feel compelled to respond either directly or indirectly. And I think I hear you saying that that could really undermine our position and put us in the position of, as Trump describes, as appearing to be enemies.
Yes, exactly. If I can go back and tell a story involving Watergate, it was January 1973, and Katharine Graham, who was the owner, publisher of the Washington Post, invited me to come have lunch with her. Now, we had published the stories in the fall of 1972, tracking the Watergate operation and other sabotage and espionage to the Nixon White House, the Nixon Re-election Committee. The problem we had is people almost across the board did not believe it. It was too inconceivable. The conventional wisdom was that Nixon was too smart to be involved in these things. He'd won a massive landslide re-election. So Katharine Graham, I knew a little. She supported the publication of our stories. An extraordinary for me lunch with her. So we sat down, and she started quizzing me about Watergate, and truly blew my mind with the facts. She knew. She really absorbed everything about Watergate. At one point, she mentioned that she'd read something about Watergate in the Chicago Tribune, and I remember thinking, what the hell is she reading the Chicago Tribune for? No one in Chicago does, but she did. She was sweeping it all up. Had a leadership style, which I later described as mind on, hands off. Literally knew everything, but she didn't tell editors how to edit, reporters how to edit. She kept her hands off. So we're going through the lunch, and she was the CEO, chief executive officer, and had the killer CEO question, which was, when is the truth going to come out? And I said, because the cover-up was going on, because the initial Watergate burglars were being paid for their silence, because the people that Carl and I would go see after Nixon won re-election would slam the doors in our faces. So my answer to her was never. The whole truth is never going to come out. And she looks like you do. Consternation, pain, wounded look on her face, what you never want to see in your boss. And she looked at me and she said, never, don't tell me, never. And I left the lunch a highly motivated employee. But what she did, she said, look, and her statement was not a threat, it was a statement of purpose, really. She said, look, the president is involved in this, we believe, from our sources. So because it's the president, we have a triple, quadruple responsibility to get to the bottom of this. Accelerate your effort, keep working, keep digging. And then she asked a great question. She said, why? Why do you think we're doing this? And I did not have an answer, quite honestly. And she answered her own question. She said, because that's the business we are in. We are in the newspaper business. We're dig into things where people are not happy with us and what we do, but we have to assume that risk, and we're not going to be loved, and take it on my authority, she said, that I want you to keep, and Carl Bernstein and the whole newspaper, to keep working on this story. And I remember leaving the lunch, I was 29 years old at the time, thinking, my God, the boss gets it. This is the business we're in. And if we think it's somehow ping pong or some sort of not serious contact sport, we're deluding ourselves. And I don't mean physically, it's not a contact sport, but we are going to be denounced, we're going to be called. People do not like us to dig in and find out the truth, particularly when there are cover-ups going on, and there are all kinds of cover-ups that go on in government. So if I may say this, someday we're going to put a plaque on the wall in the lobby of the Washington Post. And even though Jeff Bezos, the Amazon CEO, owns the Post, not the Graham family anymore, and he's been doing a great job of supporting all the investigative efforts of the Post, but we're going to put that plaque in the wall. We're going to drill it in so no one can take it out, and it's simply going to say, begin quote, never, don't tell me, never, end quote. Catherine Graham, January 1973.
She exemplifies the kind of publisher we all dream of, and I can say it, her attitude and style permeates this association here. The editors and publishers in this room, they're all very sincere about what they're doing, and they're dedicated to it. And she's been a model, but they're carrying it out every day here. And it's great to hear that you had that experience face-to-face with her.
Yeah, well, it's not just an experience, it's an attitude. The boss creates an atmosphere of go to it, and she was the one who was assuming the risk. I was young, and if it didn't turn out, I could have found something else to do, like go to law school. But when you have that level of support, if I may say, before this book came out, I called the book on Trump. I called Jeff Bezos, who owns the Post. I've known him for years. And I said, this book is coming out, and it's going to have lots of things that the president is not going to like, but they are well documented, and we've gone through it, and the Post is going to run stories about it. And Jeff Bezos said to me, I have your back. In other words, that was the voice, that was the echo of Katharine Graham saying, keep doing it. This is the business we're in, and so you see that continuity between her, Don Graham, who was the CEO of the Post for years, and Jeff Bezos, the now owner. And so we're willing to engage in this. Now, if we start having violence as a response to what the press is doing, then we are entering a new dark and alarming era, and let's hope not.
We have, I'd love to follow on that point of violence, but we have a good question, a series of questions from students at San Paulo University, and here they are. I'll give you three, and so they're all related. Sure. Is the free press threatened by the Trump administration? Are you worried about any kind of persecution of yourself by the president? Are you afraid for your life?
I am not, but you don't know. And when you have the president of the United States, who has tens of millions of supporters, getting up at a rally and praising a congressman, an elected member of the legislature in our country, praising him for body slamming and acting violently to a reporter, who knows what's going to happen, where you have somebody who considers that a signal to go ahead and attack the press. I don't think it's going to happen. I think, again, there is such an important tradition in the United States of the free press operating. As I've been around the country talking to people about my new book on Trump, Fear, there are a lot of people who are Trump supporters. I say to them, this is not partisan, this is factual, and it's something that people better look at, whether they like him or don't like him. This is what is happening, and bottom line, what the president is doing, he has got a series of policies where he is gambling. He is gambling in the new tariff trade war with China. He is gambling with North Korea, being very tough on them for a while. If you go back to President Reagan in the 1980s, President Reagan went to Berlin and said to Gorbachev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. At the time, maybe you remember, that was thought to be very confrontational and almost shocking. And of course, Reagan did not say to Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev, my nuclear button is bigger than yours. And of course, that's what Trump said publicly to Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. So he's upped the emotions and the attacks and the gambling on all kinds of issues. I have 10 or 12 that are singled out in the book, and presidents need to do new things and need to take reasonable risk, but some of these risks are just so great. The trade issues, for instance, the NAFTA agreement among the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Trump hated it, has renegotiated a new agreement. It's 1,800 pages. I don't think too many people have read it. I've talked to experts on both sides about it, saying it actually is a more restrictive trade agreement. Some products, there's going to be more tariffs, and at the same time, it's not that different. And so the president gets up and says, this is the biggest, most important trade agreement ever negotiated. And he has his say, and we in my business need to look at the details and assess whether his statements are true or not, because they are often just untrue.
He has a very loud voice, and he gets through to a lot of people. We've got on the threat question, that's been buzzing in my back of my head. Tell us about some of the threats you've gotten, if you've gotten any, and what security precautions do you take for yourself and your wife?
I just take reasonable precautions. Interestingly enough, since this book has been out, I've received no real threats. Some people have said, well, what about this? They've asked questions about it. There is not a culture of violence when it comes to the government and the press in this country. There is a culture of tension and disagreement. Trump is really, it's the old Nixon playbook to a certain extent, make the press the issue, make their conduct the issue rather than the conduct of the president. There's always been tension, but there is not a culture of violence, and let's hope it does not get to that. It is the job of the media to turn down not the heat in terms of facts, but on this emotional response to Trump. If I may go back to Katharine Graham, when she was the owner-publisher of the Washington Post during Watergate. After Nixon resigned in 1974, she wrote a private letter to Carl Bernstein and myself. And she said, very directly, okay, you did some of the stories, he resigned, don't start thinking too much of yourself. And then she said, I have some very specific advice for you, and that is beware the demon pomposity of being pompous. And that is good advice for everyone in the media. I think there's a lot of pomposity in the media, people saying this is the way it is, this is the only way to look at it. There's a lot of pomposity in politics, a lot of pomposity in business, and it is a stance that generally does not work, and people can smell it, and they may not, they may like somebody who's pompous, they may agree with him or her, but Katharine Graham's, that maybe should be another plaque in the lobby of the Washington Post. Beware the demon pomposity.
Excellent, excellent. The title of your book is Fear. Ariano Lozano, an editor in Diario Libre in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, asks, what do you mean by fear? How did you choose that word?
Good question. 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, when Trump was running for president and about to get the Republican nomination, a young reporter at the Post named Bob Costa and I went and interviewed Trump. We, like everyone, kind of thought, well, gee, is he going to actually win the presidency? Probably not. So we asked him lots of big questions, high-minded questions. And one of the things we dwelled on was the issue of power, because the presidency is about power. And we cited some things President Obama had said about power, namely in President Obama's first inaugural, he said, power comes from restraint and humility. And you could see Trump was not taken with the concept of restraint and humility. And he said, at one point, he said, real power is, and it was almost Shakespearean, like Hamlet turning in an aside to the audience, saying, this is what's really going on. This is what's happening. And Trump said, real power is, I don't even want to use the word, real power is fear. And as I spent a couple of years looking at him and his campaign and presidency, he exercises fear. He uses it to scare the bejesus out of people, and it's part of his technique. I wanted to use something from him as the title because lots of things had been suggested. For instance, the former chief of staff to Trump in the White House said that Trump fails the Lincoln test when Lincoln was president in the Civil War. He had what was called a team of rivals. The chief of staff for Trump said they don't have a team of rivals, they have a team of predators, and that the White House is a zoo without walls. That was an alternative title, but I think fear captures Trump's operating style, and I think it also captures how lots of people feel about his presidency.
You wrote a lot about, we know what you wrote about Nixon and what ended up with Nixon. He left the White House, he resigned facing impeachment, and there probably is nobody more expert on Nixon at the time. You're positioning yourself, I'm sure you weren't thinking about positioning, but you've become an expert in great depth with Trump. Where is Trump going to end up the way Nixon ended up?
I have the answer to that written down here. I'm kidding. I don't. Who knows? There is a serious investigation into Russian meddling in the election. Robert Mueller, as the special counsel, has independence, at least so far, to make that inquiry very aggressively. It's not clear whether he has something new, whether it is going to involve the president directly or his top aides. A report is supposedly coming out. It's very difficult. After Watergate, there was the scandal in the Reagan administration called Iran-Contra of selling arms secretly to Iran. In the Clinton presidency, there was the Monica Lewinsky relationship with the president where he was impeached, but the Senate did not vote him out of office, which is the constitutional procedure. If you look back at Watergate, you need what happened in Watergate. They had a witness, John Dean, who was Nixon's White House counsel, who testified for 4 days straight about orders he received from Nixon that were illegal, that were part of the cover-up and all of the Watergate operations. Then the Senate Watergate Committee discovered the Nixon tapes, which was critical to establishing the criminality and illegality. And finally, the Republicans, Nixon's own party, turned on him. So you had two elements that the first is some sort of clarity about what happened. In the Trump-Russia case, there's a lot of denial, there's some evidence, it's not clear that you have that narrator, that storytelling witness, which John Dean was. And you don't, as best we can tell, have secret tape recordings which would provide the kind of evidence that would establish something happened that was illegal or something that didn't. So we're going to have to wait and see. Color me, wait and see. In the book, I describe in some detail the relationship between Trump and his personal lawyer, John Dowd, for 8 months in the Mueller investigation. And they adopted a strategy initially of turning over all the evidence and documents, and that has been questioned by people, but at the end of the book, they conclude, Trump and his lawyer, that Mueller has something they don't know about, and that maybe they'd been played for suckers by Mueller. So we're going to have to see what happens. But at the end of the book, John Dowd, now this is the lawyer, this is not a critic, somebody who worked those 8 months with him, intensely concludes that the president is an effing liar. And the whole issue of truth and what's true and how we find that truth is at the center of what's going on now. We're going to see in the upcoming elections in the United States whether there's a change of who controls the legislature. But as I told the president in August when he called, we are at a pivot point in history, and indeed we are.
It might turn out we get 4 years of Trump then.
Anything can happen.
We've got one more question, Bob. We're right on the cusp of time, and someone else is asking this, I think. Hold on 1 second.
Sure.
Well, we're looking for that question. This follows exactly on what you were saying, and it is simply, some people say boldly, Trump stole the election. The Russians, various internet hijinks and so on. What is your sense of that?
Really an important question, because in 3 states he won by just tens of thousands of votes, and if 80,000 votes had shifted from the 120 million plus that were cast, the election would have been won by Hillary Clinton. The real experts on this conclude that we'll never know for sure, because you can't find the people who were impacted if they were impacted by what Russia was doing on this. It turns out what Russia was doing was much more aggressive, much more widespread in putting out false information, and their role allegedly in getting the emails from Clinton and from the Democratic Party. So it's hard to say. I don't think anyone's going to prove it. There've been some remarkable examinations of it. One done by Kathleen Jamieson in a book called Cyber War, saying she thinks it made a difference, but proving it, and what would you do then if it were proved? Trump is president. He's been declared the president and the victory in the election. And going back, as lots of people do, say, well, Hillary Clinton won more of the popular vote. That's interesting, but meaningless in terms of determining under the constitutional system we have who won the presidency. And Trump won the presidency. He's a legitimate president. I don't think that's going to change. The question is, what has he done and what are the risks he is taking? And they are across the board. And people in the United States better not be numb to what's going on, but better wake up to it. And my biggest worry is, if there's a serious crisis. The president does not have a team. They don't strategize. He does things by the seat of the pants. He's very impulsive. And if we had a serious crisis, there have been two in the United States.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we've got to get into the last question here, and the clock
Yes,
is against it.
sure.
It's been a fabulous conversation, and I think everybody's really, there's not a pin dropping out here. It's perfectly focused on you. This is from Maria Elvira Dominguez, the incoming president of the Inter-American Press Association. She's the publisher of El País, a newspaper in Cali, Colombia. She's back to the issue of fear. Fear goes way beyond your title. It's a fabulous title. I think the options you had, fear is really working, and as we know, it's flying off the bookshelves. I wasn't able to buy one when I went into my bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, backlogged everywhere. Fabulous. So here's her question. Trump in the White House, fear. Is it because that's how people should see Trump? Should they be afraid of him?
Well, people better, when you say somebody should be afraid, people should be deeply concerned. One of the experiences I've had in the last 47 years, I've written articles for the Washington Post or books about 9 of our presidents, from Nixon to Trump. That's 20% of the presidents we've had, because Trump is the 45th. And it's very clear to me, and I believe the record, that presidents get more and more power with each presidency. And because Trump uses the media the way he does, if you follow the news, it will start out in the morning that there's something important that's going to grab everyone's attention, and then Trump will send out a tweet, and all the media will shift to covering that. He controls the conversation in a way that is absolutely astounding. I think would be unimagined by people like Nixon and Reagan. I think at the same time, because he controls the conversation, because the Constitution is very clear, the executive power of the United States is invested in one person, the president, not a committee, not the White House staff, not the cabinet officers, the president. He, as has been demonstrated in Vietnam and Iraq, presidents all by themselves can start wars. So we better be very watchful, and we have our work cut out for us. And Joe, I'm going to adopt your idea of working 24/7, even work during your sleep if possible.
Well, for accuracy, I always thought I was working 24 hours, and I know that that's impossible, but being fully engaged in the job is really the point I was making, and I think you made that too. If you want to really do a job of journalism and live a life that you can reflect well on and do a service to the country, you need to be deeply immersed.
And if you look at back to the 2016 elections, I think one of the failings of the media in general, and I think of myself in particular, is we never got Trump's tax returns. Those tax returns would have been a window into who he was and what he did in all of his real estate operations, and 6 bankruptcies. Think of that, 6 bankruptcies, unheard of. And we didn't find a way to get them. So aggressiveness, lots to do. Let's hope the conflict does not get to the point that what happened to the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi is not a foreshadowing of the world we are going to live in the coming weeks, months, and years as journalists.
Indeed, and we're living that kind of experience in Latin America. And just this year, this calendar year so far, we've lost 24 journalists, 23 killed, 1 missing.
That's right. I know about that, and I should have commented on that. And the risk and what has happened in these cases is stunning. Let's hope that does not migrate to the United States, but the journalists who work in Latin America are to be saluted for their bravery and courage, and in the face of violence, to forge ahead is, is quite spectacular, and it makes those of us in the United States, at least so far, look like we have easy street.
Well, I know you don't have easy street, and it's not easy anywhere when you're doing it the right way. We're going to end the conversation now. We want to pay tribute to those people who lost their lives and the one who's missing. And we're going to have a moment of silence here, and we hope you'll stay with us just for that 1 minute where we show our thoughts are with the families of those who've died.
Indeed, I promise.
Sí, well, primero, muchas gracias a nuestro conductor. Thank you very much, Bob Woodward. It is an honor to participate in this conversation. Y efectivamente queríamos cerrar esta mañana diciendo que sentíamos como nuestro a Jamal Khashoggi, el corresponsal del Washington Post, que fue muerto en condiciones muy extrañas en la embajada de Arabia Saudita en Estambul. Como ustedes saben, Emiratos Árabes, Arabia Saudita dio la versión de que se involucró en una golpiza que le causó la muerte. Esta mañana el presidente Trump dijo que le parecía confiable esa versión. Queríamos pedirles que con él en cuenta y con todos los demás periodistas asesinados este año guardáramos un minuto de silencio en este momento.